Hi everyone, it's James here. Welcome back to the channel. Bit of an impromptu video this week, not one that I had been intending to make, but I really did want to just come on quickly and talk about the two major artists who have passed away this week. First of all, at the beginning of the week, I think it was, we got the news that Sly Stone had died, and then a couple of days ago, another bombshell, Brian Wilson as well. So I couldn't really, in all honesty, I couldn't see a way of not doing this. Because both these artists meant a tremendous amount to me, really, in my younger days. So I thought I would just roll the two videos into one, rather than trying to do separate videos. You know, some people, I guess, might not think of Sly Stone and Brian Wilson in the same breath, but I think there were some parallels. I think, well, for a start, they both died at the age of 82, coincidentally. But I think also I think they shared something. They definitely shared a pioneering spirit. Sly Stone was a studio auteur, really. He had his band with him, obviously, as Brian had the Beach Boys. You know, Sly and the Family Stone, the first major, I think, or maybe the first ever truly multicultural rock funk band. And they were so influential, and the stuff they did was so ahead of the curve, really, and they influenced so many people. Later down the line, you had people like Prince, of course, but even before then, you know, he influenced Stevie Wonder, George Clinton, and I guess he took a long-standing form of music and put his own twist on it, put his own spin on it. Bit of a melting pot of styles, really. He had the rock and the funk, the soul and the gospel. But it was that studio thing, it was the studio, it was his ability to just go mad in the studio, which I think was one of the things that he really contributed in a major way. I'm thinking of the album There's a Riot Going On, which I showed recently in a CD video that I did. This was the album he made when he was descending deep into probably cocaine abuse in the early 1970s, and he lost himself with the drum machine in the studio and just laid down all these weird, spooky tracks. But he was very much a person who had his own vision of music, I suppose, and his own working methods, and he was just able to carve something totally unique. And Brian Wilson, much the same, and in fact interesting also, you know, a person with drug problems, somebody who descended into absolute hell, really, in the 1970s, as Sly Stone did, but clearly a very singular vision. And Brian had his demons, but he also had this great genius. And just in terms of my own sort of connection with this music, Brian Wilson definitely came first. I got this copy of Pet Sounds, this CD, from Phase 1 Records in Wrexham in, I'm going to guess, somewhere around 1994, 5, something like that. And it was during that period when I'd started to read music magazines. I was looking to expand my music collection. You check out the Pet Sounds, you check out the Forever Changes, and just all these records which are just, I suppose, permanently being featured in those music magazines back in the 90s, those very influential music magazines. You had, you know, Q Magazine and Vox and Select. I was very, very into all that. It was the pre-internet days. It was really difficult to find out about music that you'd missed, but Pet Sounds was definitely a biggie, and I can still remember rushing down to Phase 1 Records in Wrexham when I was back home visiting my parents in North Wales, brought it home and listened to it. I don't think it knocked me out on first listen. It was something which I instinctively liked. There was nothing about it which I disliked, but I guess it took a while for me to kind of quite understand some of the stuff that Brian was doing on here. I mean, it helped hearing stories from other people that I admired, you know, the famous story about Paul McCartney saying that God Only Knows was the greatest song ever written, and the fact that the Beatles and the Beach Boys had this sparring relationship, or rather Brian had this sparring relationship with the Beatles, the whole thing of, I think it was, he'd heard the American copy of Rubber Soul, hadn't he, which inspired him to do Pet Sounds, and then the Beatles responded, and he had Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, and then Brian famously then went mad in the studio making the Smile album, which we'll get to in a moment. So anyway, yeah, so Pet Sounds, obviously one of those giant albums, nowadays gets a bit of a mixed reaction. I tend to find that people maybe people react to this idea or this dogma that's come down, you know, it's the greatest album ever made, and therefore there's a bit of a reaction to it. And I think sometimes people say they can't really see what all the fuss is about. I go through phases with Pet Sounds. I go through phases when I think it is the greatest album ever made, and then I go through other phases when I much prefer other Beach Boys albums, and I prefer other phases of Brian's career. This is a vinyl copy I picked up. It was a limited edition from Simply Vinyl, which I picked up from HMV here in Lancaster, the old HMV, because HMV closed down. I suspect it's a digital record, but it actually sounds really, really nice. I go to this probably more than I do the CD, and I always enjoy it on vinyl. I think it does sound really good. I've never heard an original pressing of it, and if this is a digital copy, I've never heard an analog recording of it, because I've only got this and the CD. But it sounds really nice to me, and one of the things that I always kind of think about Pet Sounds, which surprises me when I hear people slagging it off, and maybe they slag it off because they don't like the songs, or they don't like maybe the lyrics are I think they're a little bit, I don't know, sort of teenage, a little bit naive, I suppose, compared to some of the stuff the Beatles were doing at the time. You know, think of Tomorrow Never Knows, and, you know, things like Good Morning on Sgt. Pepper, and think of what Syd Barrett was doing on Piper at the Gates of Dawn. There's something very innocent about Pet Sounds. I know years ago I lived with a guy. We shared a house together, and he was really into psychedelic music. He really loved Piper at the Gates of Dawn, and he loved Jimi Hendrix and that kind of thing. And he really didn't like Pet Sounds because I think he saw it as just a bit too teenage, a bit too naive, a bit too gauche maybe. And I can see that. You know, musically, I think the songs are mostly really great. Obviously, you've got God Only Knows, which is an absolute classic, but those wonderful harmonies on You Still Believe in Me, the second track, and just that wonderful sequence of tracks towards the end, I Just Wasn't Made for These Times, Caroline No, you know, beautiful songs. But the actual sound of this record, the actual sounds that Brian Wilson was able to conjure in the studio, I mean, it's so mellifluous, and it's just got this sort of creamy, oozy kind of texture. It just sounds beautiful. It's sort of candy floss for the ears, really. It just brings great pleasure. It brings great aesthetic pleasure to hear it, just to hear the sounds that he made, the unusual combinations of instruments, the unusual textures, and I think a sense of humour that runs through it as well. You know, you kind of all the little sleigh bells and just the vocal stuff was extremely inventive. It was rooted in a particular tradition, that kind of doo-wop thing, or the kind of, you know, the barbershop style harmony singing, but taken to another level, really. Brian Wilson, I think you could hear with Brian Wilson, and again, this is probably why he's similar to Sly Stone, when you listen to his music, you can hear this great obsessiveness, attention to detail, really. Brian was famously like that in the studio. He was an auteur. He knew exactly what he wanted, and he would direct everybody. And, you know, of course, unlike the Beatles, at this point in the Beach Boys' career, he was using session musicians. So, again, you've got that kind of slickness, that very professional quality to it, which is very different to the Beatles. About 6 months ago, I played this record back to back with Sgt. Pepper. I was trying to work out which one I preferred. I might even have been doing it in order to make a video, but it was just impossible because I played them back to back and I thought, they're just so different. They're just chalk and cheese, really. I think even with the Beatles in 1967, the Beatles were still punk rockers in a way, in a strange way. Their stuff was much more off the street. It was much more, I don't know how you describe it, really. It had sort of improvisatory quality, just using the facilities that they had, you know, using George Martin, obviously. But there was definitely a kind of ad hoc quality to it, a slightly amateurish feel to the Beatles stuff, even when they were doing stuff as advanced as Sgt. Pepper. You don't get that on Pet Sounds. On Pet Sounds, you just get this very, very polished, mellifluous, just wonderfully produced music. In a way, I suppose it's got more in common with a band like Queen, I think, than the Beatles. You could probably compare this record, Pet Sounds, compare it to Night at the Opera by Queen, maybe, more than something like Sgt. Pepper, because it just has that very fastidious quality, polished, I keep coming back to this word mellifluous, classical. And maybe again, that's one of the things that people perhaps don't like about it, the fact that maybe it's just not rocking enough, hasn't got quite enough of that rock and roll sort of grit to it, the spirit of rock and roll. Maybe too much of a polished production, all of which I think is true, and I think sometimes that's why the record maybe doesn't quite agree with me as much as it does to other people. Other times I listen to it and I just think it's an absolute work of genius. Let's face it, it's Brian Wilson's Kind of Blue, isn't it? Miles Davis, you know, everybody always talks about Kind of Blue. With Pet Sounds, Brian Wilson, everybody always talks about Pet Sounds, but there's more. I think there was more to Brian Wilson than Pet Sounds. This box set was really, really important to me when I was in my mid-20s. I bought it in Leeds. It's an Originals Beach Boys box set. It contains Beach Boys Today, which I think came from it's mid-60s, isn't it, I think. Summer Days, which was a bit of a reaction to Beach Boys Today, because I don't think Beach Boys Today was particularly successful, and Summer Days went back to a more poppy sound. This is the album that's got California Girls on it. It's got the remake of Help Me Rhonda. Just a couple of absolute killer tracks on here. You've got Let Him Run Wild on side 2, which is one of my favourite Beach Boys songs. I did a whole video on that album a couple of years ago. And then this was the record that really, I got really obsessed with. This version of it on this particular CD, this Smiley Smile, which obviously was the abandoned record that Brian, he couldn't see a way to finish it. He was mentally collapsing. He was trying to outdo Sgt. Pepper, and he just couldn't do it. He just ended up slamming against a brick wall, essentially a creative brick wall. But this record, I just loved this. Back in the 90s, I listened to it. It starts with Heroes and Villains, but then it just goes off into really strange acid, strange territory, just really fragmentary songs, really stuff that he never finished, or maybe tried to finish it later on. He had a voice. I think the thing with Brian Wilson, you can strip away all the production, you can strip away all the studio auteur magic, but I think essentially what Brian Wilson had, I think he had two things. I think he had just this wonderful voice that could just absolutely capture your heart, just one of the great voices. I think Carl Wilson also had a great voice too, but Brian's voice I think was definitely special. And then he just had that great melodic sense and also a harmonic sense as well. The great thing about his writing often is the way that he would come up with unusual chordal progressions, a bit like think of somebody like Scott Walker. He was just able to orchestrate and to create harmonies that were just interesting and different, not really what you'd expect. He'd change bass notes, so you'd have a chord, and the bass note would not be the bass note that you'd normally expect in that chord, and he would move through really interesting harmonic progressions that increasingly, as the 60s wore on, became genuinely groundbreaking. And I think that was one of the things that people like Paul McCartney really responded to, the idea that this guy, he was a composer, he wasn't just a kind of two-bit songwriter, he was definitely, I think he was definitely a musical genius, really. So anyway, that was Brian. Rest in peace, Brian. And I will talk more about him in some videos coming forth later this year. So Sly Stone I got into a bit later, sort of towards the end of the decade, towards the end of the 90s, and this was the CD I bought. I don't remember now how I came across Sly Stone. I was already listening to George Clinton and Parliament, Funkadelic, Stevie Wonder, so maybe this was just the next thing on the list. I really can't remember, but I absolutely loved this. I played this to death. 20 songs on here. You've got everything from Dance to the Music, Family Affair, which is from Riot Going On, Stand, of course, one of his great anthems, Everyday People, Hot Fun in the Summertime. I included that recently when I did a series of videos, my favourite US songs of all time. I think I had Hot Fun in the Summertime. I think it was at number 3, below Surf's Up, funnily enough, which is my favourite American song of all time, and Bridge Over Troubled Water, I think, or perhaps another Simon & Garfunkel one, I can't remember. Anyway, it was top 3. I just loved this, absolutely loved it. For some reason though, I never got massively into Sly Stone as an albums artist. I got this one on CD, this is Fresh, which is a bit of a later one. This is the one that's got the opening track, In Time, which is a really important track in terms of its drum rhythm. It was a drum machine But Andy Newmark, the drummer who later went on to play with John Lennon and a host of other people, played this really strange, intricate drum pattern over it, and it had everybody scratching their heads as to what on earth he was doing. I picked up a few records by him back in the day from the library, I think, and I burnt CDs of them, but then I lost the CDs along the way. So just one of those things. It's just a real classic greatest hits artist that I never really sort of ploughed deeply into the albums. I got this, which I showed earlier. This is a record which I did used to really like this back in my 20s, but these days I struggle sometimes to connect with it because it's quite dark and nightmarish and fragmented and a bit strange. It's a very psychological album, but it's got some great stuff on it. But as I said, it's Sly Stone holed up in a mansion in LA somewhere and just basically going mad. I've got a 33 1/3 book about it, actually. Hang on, I'll get it. So that great series, 33 1/3, I've got the Right Going On book on that. Not read that for a long time. I need to revisit that. So anyway, yeah, just thought I'd quickly show that. And the only other thing I've got from Sly, no, I've got two things. I've got a reissue of their first record. I think this is a different cover to the original. Yeah, so the Sly debut record, and then this, the classic greatest hits vinyl record, which I think I picked this up maybe last year from Heightside Records here in Lancaster. It's not quite as comprehensive as the CD greatest hits, but it's got pretty much all the ones you'd want on here. And then we've got the fantastic gatefold there, and the great picture of Sly on the back, and the music of Sly Stone. Essentially, it soundtracked a period in my life right at the end of the 90s when I was coming out of a dark patch, really struggling in my personal life, struggling with my work life. Everything was sort of going in the wrong direction. I discovered Sly and the Family Stone, and then everything seemed to improve. Just his music just kind of soundtracked that, essentially. And when something like that happens, it really it leaves an impression. In the mid-90s, I think already I was probably having a hard time in certain respects, and I can definitely remember albums like Smiley Smile really helping me get through that. Brian Wilson's Strange Interior World. I think him and Sly Stone were able to visit the dark places but come out of it with something very heartwarming and life-affirming. So yeah, I think really strange that they both went in the same week, but that often is the way. That'll do for now. That's much longer than I intended, so I hope you enjoyed it. Yeah, rest in peace, Brian Wilson, Sly Stone. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back soon.